Now we're in Genesis chapter 1. We'll look at a verse there in a moment. Before that, I'm going to announce the title of our study. Now, only probably Denny Walters would have a study entitled The Biblical Significance of Eunuchs on Father's Day. I know that, eunuchs cannot be fathers. But we're going to study about eunuchs and their significance, because there is a grand significance that God has for these men as far as symbolism is concerned. But one other thing with regard to Father's Day, Mother's Day, all the other special days, though I want to honor fathers and mothers, sometimes we get bogged down in the same old traditional business. So I thought I'd take it to the other extreme and talk about something that the Bible talks about, eunuchs. Now, just by way of introduction here, often we go through the scriptures and the Bible talks about circumcision and uncircumcision. And I've had people, ask, why in the world would the Word of God contain such a subject as this? I mean, it is. It's private. It's personal. It has to do with sex and something that is extremely secret with regard to our own persons. It's not something that is supposed to be so public and displayed. And yet, it is a doctrine that absolutely permeates the Word of God. From the point of Abraham onward, and in fact all the way back, because from Adam onward to Abraham, there was no such thing as circumcision. Then you have the Abrahamic covenant, and this as a necessary token to enjoy spiritual blessings. You see, that's what people don't understand. Regarding household salvation, if the patriarch of that house did not have this religious rite performed on him, they couldn't be saved. He couldn't be saved. And yet people read through the scriptures and don't have the foggiest notion as to why God puts an emphasis on something like circumcision. Well, then you come to the Word of God, and you begin reading passages of scriptures that deal with eunuchs. Now you think to yourself, okay, now what spiritual significance could this have? Why did God include that in His Word? All the things we talk about, God is love and all that shit. It's because these men have for us in their physical condition an illustration. And God is going to use that as an illustration to drive home some points to all men. Men who have sexual organs and an apparatus intact, and men who do not have it intact. And God uses both type men in the scriptures to teach spiritual lessons. And so that's something that we're going to try to present in this study. There is a biblical significance to that of eunuchs. Now, one more thing that's important, and that is oftentimes, and here is Christianity today, they only want to hear what tickles their ears. And so preachers have these little sermonette type deals where it's been good to have been in the house of the Lord, and all of this business that they say. And they read the Bible, and they come to words like a eunuch, and they haven't a clue as to why God would put that in there. It's important that we understand the entire spectrum of doctrine, from uncircumcision to circumcision to eunuchism, and that's what we're going to discuss. And every other doctrine that God has, from the third heaven down to the earth and the middle part of the earth, all of that is important. So, this may not be, your thing. It's always exciting to hear about prophecy and the beast and the mark of the beast. But I guarantee you that understanding uncircumcision, circumcision, and eunuchism is important to know. Because you read these words and you can't figure out what God is trying to drive at by mentioning these types of people. But the first thing we're going to do, by way of our introduction, is look at verse number 27 in Genesis chapter 1. Now, we had a study, I think it was last year, on the absolute necessity of sexual orientation and identity. Knowing who you are. It's an interesting thing, and we'll just use something that is relevant to this morning. We were honoring the men of the church. Would all the men of the church stand up? I almost wanted to say from my chin back there, but I bit my tongue. You know who you are. Why? Because you have sexual orientation and identity. The reason that you're called men and you're different from women is because of your sex. And that's what God is trying to tell us right here. It all starts with a sexual orientation. Verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Now, I do plan to have some documentation for you in a study guide, but for right now, I'm not finished with everything that I want in the study guide. So I'm just going to read for you what we have as a result of this. God started off with a male and a female, and from that we get words in the Bible that demand sexual orientation. For example, man and woman, as a result of being male and female. In the same early context of the Bible, you have husband and wife. Therefore, shall a man leave his father and mother. You have a son and a daughter, a boy or a girl, an aunt or an uncle, a bridegroom and a bride, a king and a queen, him and her, he and she. Need I go on to show that God, right here, on the basis of sexual identity and orientation, establishes the fact that the Bible is a book all about sexual activity. Now, if you want to document that, we're here in the book of Genesis. Let's go to chapter 1 here, where we are, and look at the law of reproduction in kind. Verse 11. Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind. And all through this you have this law of reproduction in kind. And when you finally come to verse number 27 here, God is talking about man and woman reproducing in kind. Now, remember that artificial insemination is a relatively recent phenomenon. If you wanted to have kids back in them days, you had to do it the old-fashioned way, and that is through sexual intercourse. And so verse number 28 says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Now, that's the second point. From the law of reproduction in kind, God created human beings that were supposed to reproduce their species. And then he gave what's called the dominion mandate for the multiplication of species. And that's why it says, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And so that's why when Adam and Eve, first night they were kicked out of the garden, Adam knew Eve and she conceived and bare Cain. Then she bare Abel. Then she bare Seth. And who knows how many other kids. Please excuse me. It's the dust, it's the ozone, it's the farmers in the field that are just getting to me. Not that I blame the farmers in the field. You see, when the farmers go to the field, they raise food. And food is good. Food is my friend and our friend. So please, don't misunderstand that. But they still get to you after a while. But here is the natural law of reproduction in kind. Then the dominion mandate for multiplication of species. Now we have in chapter 3, verse number 15 of Genesis, the historic conflict between the two seeds. Well, what does that mean? That means that throughout human existence and human history, there's going to be reproduction. There's going to be multiplication of the seeds now that are established. 2 lines, one to Christ, one to Antichrist, one children of the devil, one children of God. So verse 15 says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed, indicating multiplication or reproduction of species, and her seed, with the same thing there. All right, let's come to chapter 5. Now, one of the reasons that we know that the Bible is a book documenting sexual activity is because of all of these various things. And I just want to ask you, do you know how you got here and this generation of humanity got here? Because one generation produced another generation, produced another generation, and another generation, all the way back to the beginning. And there's going to be future generations by the very same process. Now the thing is, God has recorded that in His Word. Adam knew Eve. And even in the line of Christ, I'll take you there because we've been there enough times. But it's Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, Jacob the 12, Judah begat this one, and all the way up to Joseph. And then you go through the line of that's mentioned, Mary's line in Luke. But one of the ones we want to look at here is the line of Noah. So you look up to verse 1 of Genesis 5. And it says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. That is, the activity that has ensued of reproducing the human race from this man. Sexual activity. In the day that God created man in his likeness. And it says that Adam lived 130 years and begat a son, and his name was Seth. And so throughout this entire chapter, you have this man begetting this son, and then he became a father and begat this son, and on you go. That's a record of sexual activity, of reproduction, of somebody that could impart his seed, conceive seed, bear a son, and continue the human race in an ongoing fashion. Now, of course, this particular genealogy or record of activity is for Noah. That brings us down to verse 32. And Noah was 500 years old, and then Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then we learn from chapter 9 that it's from these 3 sons that the entire world was populated. So the Bible records this type of activity. Come to Psalms 105. Psalms 105. Now, another reason as we document this, and I'm doing this for a purpose, and that is, all of this activity is documented, all of these sons that have been begotten, all of the generations that have been born. You come to a fellow like a eunuch, and he cannot bear children, and he does not physically have what is needed. We're dealing with eunuchs under the kingdom. In dispensation of grace, it doesn't matter. But under the kingdom concept, he does not have what is needed to display the token of the Abrahamic covenant. Now, that's a problem. Why? Because you can't get saved unless you have that token. So God has to make an exception for them under certain conditions to be saved. But here's the 5th reason why the Bible is a history book of sexual activity. Verse number 6. O ye seed of Abraham, his servant, ye children of Jacob, his chosen. God has a chosen race that demands chosen genetics, that demands the genetic link from Abraham on. And this is extremely important because the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 have died. And what God told them must be passed down to generations. We'll see that in a second. Isaiah 41. One more time, we've got a verse of Scripture that looks at the fact that God has chosen a seed or a particular type of genetic format or makeup. Verse 8, "But thou, Israel, art my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the seed of Abraham, my friend." And we actually could go on and on with verse after verse after verse that talks about Abraham and his seed and the Abrahamic covenant. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what we'll do now. But we'll look at it as our last point. Genesis chapter 17. Now let's consider everything that we've said up to this point. We're talking about, before we get to considering the physical condition of a eunuch, we're talking about the fact that the majority of the Bible focuses on sexual activity, where there are normal relations, whether in and out of the bounds of marriage, where there are normal relations between a man and a woman, and there is reproduction that occurs as a result of it. And so God, time after time, in these 6 points: 1, the natural law of reproduction in kind; the dominion mandate for multiplication of the species; the historic conflict between the two seeds; the documentation of Bible genealogies; the divine choice of Abraham's seed; and then lastly, the generational promises to Abraham's seed. This demands reproduction and activity in this realm. Look at verse number 7 in Genesis 17. "I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee," and note this clause, "in their generations." Abraham, you're going to die, but there's going to be a future Israel out from you that's going to live. And these promises are going to continue on to them. So that demands that there's reproduction. "I will establish my covenant between me and thee, your seed after you, in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God to you and to your seed after you. I will give unto your seed, to you and your seed after you, the land of Canaan." Now, that involves then, as we have tried to hammer home the point, that there is sexual activity, there is a demand for reproduction. Now, what does Antichrist try to do when the kingdom is approaching, and he's got most of the Jews that have disqualified themselves by taking the mark of the beast, and he's got this remnant of men and women? What does he try to do to them to prevent reproduction? What does Antichrist try to do to the remnant, believing remnant? Annihilate them. Why? So there's no ongoing seed. We wake out there, I didn't see even anybody, no furrowed brows, not even saying, "Kill him," or anything like that. Are you following? Or is this a soap opera type subject and I've got you so engrossed you just can't wait till the next Man, he talking about this steamy subject. Well,
get on to the castration.
No, not yet. I have to kind of condition us for that point. Okay. So, what I'm trying to say is that this is an essential part of the Bible. Now, if you're, one of the King James translators and you lived in the Victorian era, and when you've got the people that are prudish, they don't want to admit. That's why they say, "And Adam knew his wife." It's because they didn't want to say Adam had sex. They want to hide that because they wanted to prevent any immoral activity and the like, and that's fine. But you have to understand, that's what the Bible is talking about. But right here in the Abrahamic covenant, it demands that there be activity ongoing so that when the Messiah comes, by the way, that demanded sexual activity, but it was between God and a human woman, a different sort, but still, it demanded that activity that he be the seed of Abraham, the seed of David. So, now you come up to somebody who cannot reproduce. And, not only is this a dilemma in a pitiful situation for somebody who was created to reproduce. Yet in this type of situation, he not only does that, he's got his flesh mutilated. And sometimes on purpose. And we'll talk about those in just a little bit. But it is a pitiful situation, and it's really pitiful when you understand that as a man under the dispensation of law, before you could get saved, you had to be circumcised. Well, if the sexual organs were removed, and sometimes the entire sexual apparatus was taken from a man, this poses a real problem because he can't get saved. So what is God going to do? And that's why we have to discuss eunuchs, because God makes provision for them, even apart from the token, if they have a circumcised heart, if they come to embrace God fully with their heart. God makes their uncircumcision as though it were circumcision. And so we'll talk about those things as we turn to Genesis 39. And by the way, if you think it's easy to talk about uncircumcision, circumcision, and eunuchism in a mixed audience, you'd like to try it. But as your pastor, I feel it necessary to teach you these things. And why did I have to wear a tie on the hottest day of the year to start this? Because I am perspiring. We're going to look at the Hebrew words that involve a translation called eunuch. Now, if you were to go to an encyclopedia, if you were to go to an English dictionary, they would say that a eunuch is a castrated man. Now, that's well and good, but with the Bible, you have to understand that there's just more to it than dispensing with it and dismissing it in this fashion. So we're going to have to look in depth at the very wording to understand this man, and sometimes just how much was removed of his person, and the implications that it meant to him. Not just that he could not be married per se in that situation, but as we mentioned, he could not even be saved. So we're coming to Genesis 39. And in Genesis 39, verse number 1, we have the first mention of this word. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites. Now the word officer there is the Hebrew word saris. It's the very same word that is translated eunuch in other places. You say, we've got a problem here. What is that problem? Come down to verse number 7. And it came to pass after these things that Joseph's master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me," but he refused. And his master, who was Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh, said, I'm not going to do that, and he refused, says verse 8, his master's wife. Now, what is the problem here? The problem here, if saris always means that the man's sex organs were removed, why in the world would he have a wife? And of course, it doesn't always mean that. And here we get the real implication of being a eunuch. It's going to mean something to us when we come to the words of Jesus Christ, who says, a man can be a eunuch for the kingdom. Now, a eunuch for the kingdom meant that he was not castrated. His sex organs were not removed, but that he sacrificed that aspect of his humanity and his manhood in marriage and procreation to devote the time, all of his life, as though he were a eunuch, to bringing in the kingdom of God. And so, that's what Potiphar was. He was not castrated, but he was devoted to a master. First and foremost, he was going to do Pharaoh's bidding. So a man, it doesn't always mean that a man is in that physical condition. But it does mean that a man is devoted as though he were. Now, that may prove why Potiphar's wife was so anxious when she saw handsome, this young buck here, Joseph, and immediately tried to get him to have relations with her. Because Potiphar was so devoted and he neglected home life. That could be true. But the point we're making is, it didn't always mean that a man had his sexual organs removed. However, there are others where it absolutely means that. Book of Esther. Esther. Chapter 2. Now, the word eunuch here is saris, the very same word that was attributed to Potiphar. The root meaning of this word is to castrate. Or, as we saw with Potiphar, he did not have this operation performed. He was a married man, but he lived as though he were devoted to his master's bidding. Chapter 2 here in Esther, starting with verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered that Vashti, his wife, what she had done, and what was decreed against her. Then said the king's servant that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. He's looking for a new wife. Let the king appoint officers in the province of his kingdom, that they might gather together all the fair virgins unto Shushan the palace, in the house of the women. And I want you to note this. There were men that were made eunuchs of other men for the express purpose of guarding the queen and a harem. Why? Well, because without the sexual apparatus in place and intact, they would have no desire and they would have no capacity to perform sex acts. There would be no rapes, there would be no wife robbing, anything like that. In the house of the women, to the custody of Haggai, the king's chamberlain. Now, keeper of the women. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what Haggai was. Haggai is the name of a man who, as keeper of the women, was a eunuch. As a matter of fact, it says so, verse number 14. In the evening she went on the morrow, she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's chamberlain. Now that's the very same word. And a chamberlain means a keeper of the bed, or the bed chamber, or the keeper of the chamber of the women. And that all of these men here were eunuchs. And it goes on down to even talk about the king's chamberlain here, the keeper of the women, and he was appointed. And it is that very same word. Now, there is no doubt then in our mind that these particular men were eunuchs and made eunuchs of the king. They guarded the women. But there were also eunuchs who guarded men. Turn to Daniel chapter 3. This prevented homosexual activity. Daniel chapter 1, not chapter 3, chapter 1. Because there were certain men placed in charge of other men. And now here's the situation. We have all heard the terrible stories of prisons where men are housed with other men, and eventually there's homosexual activity that goes on in the prison because of this. To prevent this homosexual activity, because men were devoted to guarding other men, the king had them too become eunuchs. So in both cases, men and women, these guards or chamberlains or servants, and some of them were high-up officials in the political scheme of things, become eunuchs. So that's why we have in verse number 3. The king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and the king's seed of the princes. And so he was placing eunuchs in charge of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Men with these young boys. And to prevent homosexual activity, he made these guards eunuchs. And so that's what it says. Children in whom was no blemish, they were well-favored, skillful in all wisdom, and they were handsome, smart young men. And because these other men were not around women ever, didn't have normal relations in that sense, they began to get tempted. And the king said, that's fine, we'll just remove all temptation and capability. So, come on down here to verse number 7. It talks about the prince of the eunuchs gave names to Daniel and these others. And as a matter of fact, the prince of the eunuchs, verse number 9, God brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. So, there was rapport, there was friendship, there was camaraderie, but there would be no relations because these men were eunuchs. Now, let's go to the book of Acts, chapter 8. And there's a fella that we always mention. You've heard of him in the book of Acts. And what do we call him? The Ethiopian eunuch. Well, now, I mean, did somebody just decide in the Bible they were just going to attribute this name to him? Is there any real reason why in the world God put such a man? Why do we have to study about him? There's a real reason why he's in the book of Acts. Chapter 8, verse number 27. And Philip arose. Now, first, before we finish this verse, let's go on up to verse number 25. And they, when they had testified and preached the word of the Lord, returned to Jerusalem and preached the gospel in many villages of the Samaritans. Now, we're in Acts chapter 8. What has gone on here for one full year from Acts 1 to this point? The gospel of the kingdom has been preached. And it started with a gathering of people in Jerusalem. There was a congregation of Jews in Jerusalem for Pentecost. Gift of tongues. It goes 1 year till Stephen's stoning, and then the program of Israel begins to be altered. However, there were still people being saved in the land. But now, Philip the evangelist is north in the land of Samaria. And note what it says. The angel of the Lord spake to Philip, saying, Arise, go to the south, unto the way that goeth down from Jerusalem unto Gaza, which is desert. That's all the way south. Philip is all the way north from Jerusalem in Samaria, and he's told to go all the way south to the very area where the Palestinians are fighting right now against the Jews. Now, why was he told to go there? And why wasn't this man that he is going to address now, why wasn't he saved with the congregation of Israel? I mean, why didn't he believe at the time? He obviously was there for Pentecost. He obviously was there for 1 year later for Passover and these various feasts. Why wasn't he saved? Just hold your place. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy chapter 23. And verse number 1. Now, this is something that you must understand. And please note, of course, I'm not saying that you should read this and have your morning devotions on a verse such as this. And I'm speaking very graciously and kindly, knowing we've got a mixed audience here. But you're going to read this, and you're, what's going on here? And the reason that we're going to look at this verse is because of the very issue we're talking about. He that is wounded in the stones, that means that his testes are either malfunctioning or he is a eunuch, or has his privy member cut off. Note what they were not allowed to do. Shall enter into the congregation of the Lord. Now we come back here to the book of Acts chapter 8. And as far away from Jerusalem as the land would allow, still in the land, we have Philip told by the angel of the Lord to go to the south. In verse 27, he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. Now, why wasn't he just saved in Jerusalem? Well, why didn't somebody tell him about the gospel there? It's because of the fact that they were directly removed from the congregation per se. They didn't have the same close proximity. They were not allowed to be part of that. There was that middle wall of partition that Paul talks about with Jews and Gentiles, and it was very definitely there for a man who did not have the token of circumcision or could not multiply Abrahamic seed. And by the way, for those who say, well, this man is an Ethiopian, if you'll remember, the Queen of Sheba was an Ethiopian, and Solomon undoubtedly had kids, and he may have had Solomon's genes in him is one of the reasons that he's up there. And you do have Ethiopian Jews that are black, and yet they have Jewish genetics in them. So let's look. He was a man of Ethiopia, but he was a eunuch of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. Question. Under the mindset of these people, when you've got politics and men in politics, either guarding women or working around women of higher authority, why do you suppose this man was made a eunuch? He wouldn't rape the queen. There was no problem with the queen. He would devote his life to serving the queen without any second thought of, hey, we do lunch, this type of business. There would have been no hanky-panky there. That was removed, and that was the purpose for being a eunuch. But it posed some problems for him. He was religious. He was a Jew. He undoubtedly had some Jewish genetics there, but he couldn't get in close proximity with the congregation of Israel. He couldn't be saved. Now here we're shown that God makes special provision for them if their heart turns to the Lord. That's exactly what this guy did. He was returning and sitting in his chariot, and he was reading Isaiah the prophet. The Spirit told Philip, go near and explain it. And you have Philip taking Isaiah 53, which talks about Christ, and saying, verse 35, he preached unto him Jesus. Verse 36, they went on their way, they came to a certain water, and the eunuch said, now remember, we still have, though it's beginning to be phased out, we still have kingdom gospel, which was repent and be baptized. And the eunuch said, here's water, what hinders me to be baptized? If you believe with all your heart, he answered, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He was a eunuch. And yet he was saved in the land by the kingdom message and was counted part of the kingdom congregation, albeit not totally, as we read in Deuteronomy. And he commanded the chariot stand still. They both went down into the water, and Philip and the eunuch, he baptized him. They were come out of the water. The Spirit caught Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more, but he went on his way rejoicing. Why? He was saved. The eunuch was saved apart from the requirements of the kingdom for any man. And that's the important thing, that God has made provision for them to be saved. But now, as we just have a few moments, we're going to look at the Greek word here. Because unlike the Hebrew, which leaves some option, the Greek word is a little more exacting. The word eunuch in the English is eunuchos in the Greek. And it means, or comes from, eune, meaning bed, and akain, meaning to keep. And so a eunuch was a keeper of the bed. And he posed no sexual problem to any of the women that he worked around. And that's exactly why they did it. But, as we have pointed out time and again, it did pose some problems regarding salvation. Now, this is a difficult study as we close, and we'll start part number 2 tonight. We'll probably have 3 or 4 in the series of this, because there's a lot that the Bible has to say about us, but it's difficult to give an invitation on something like this. But as a pastor, sometimes that's just the way it's got to be. Sometimes you've got to set the foundation before you're ever going to get the spiritual symbolism involved. Well, let's just talk about that symbolism and where we're headed. With regard to a man who was a eunuch that had all of his sexual organs removed, he could not produce life or seed. He could not transmit life or seed. He could not conceive life or seed. Let's talk about man's spiritual condition in light of those 3 things that the eunuch has. Man has no spiritual life in him, and he can't produce it in and of himself. Because he cannot produce it, he cannot transfer spiritual life. An unsaved man who doesn't understand the things of God cannot tell somebody else about the things of God and transfer life to them and get them saved. And then thirdly, because of that, you cannot be like Paul and say, I have begotten you with the gospel. You cannot have spiritual children. So the point that God makes with this physical eunuch is that in those very same ways, cannot produce seed, cannot transfer seed, cannot conceive seed, we too in the spiritual way are impotent. We are powerless. We can't produce it, we can't transfer it, we can't conceive it in another person. Because in and of ourselves, spiritually, we're just like that eunuch, physically. Everything has been removed, everything is displaced, nothing works and nothing functions, and it takes an act of God.